Thank you, everybody, for coming. It's great to be here and to have the chance to share with you a bit about what I've learned in researching and writing this book, and also living in China for the last 15 years. And as David said, and as the subtitle of the book suggests, this is really a work about the massive movement of people from the countryside in China to the urban centers. And right now, there's about 200 million people at any given time from the countryside or in the cities, and that number is expected to grow to about 300 million people within the next 20 years. And so that makes it really the fastest and the largest movement of people in human history, and it's really having a dramatic impact on China in terms of attitudes and values and standard of living and lifestyles and social dynamics. Everything is changing because of this movement, and also it's creating a bit of sort of unrest and upheaval. So it's really emerging in China these days as the key issue, the key domestic issue that the Chinese government is trying to tackle. And so what I wanted to do today was give you first a little bit of an overview of sort of the scale of what's happening, and then we can talk more about the issues in the book. So if we look in terms of urbanization, so Western countries generally took about 200 years to make that switch from being primarily rural societies to primarily urban societies. And China is on track to make this transition within about 50 years. And in the 30 years since China has started its opening and reform policies, its urban population has doubled. And in the next 30 years, it's expected to double yet again. So by comparison, Europe currently has 35 cities with more than 1 million people. And China right now has about 160. But by 2025, it's expected that China will have 221 cities with more than 1 million people. So that makes Europe look kind of small by comparison. And among these 221 cities will be 15 super cities, each with about 25 million people. So by comparison, the entire state of Texas has about 25 million people. So that'll be 15 cities in China, each as large as the state of Texas. And by 2030, China's urban population will reach 1 billion people. So urban China will be more populous than the North and South American continents combined. And so obviously this is a very large movement of people, and it's happening very quickly. And there's a lot of different factors sort of underlying this transition. But the people really at the heart of it are China's rural migrants. So again, as I said, there's about 200 million migrants right now, and there'll be about 300 million within the next 20 years. And I think in the West, people tend to think of China's migrants mostly as factory workers. But in fact, of the 200 million migrants that are out there right now, only about a third of them work in factories. The rest of them are intimately involved in every aspect of building up urban China and driving this urbanization. So for example, over the next 20 years, migrants will help to build 5 million new buildings, including 50,000 skyscrapers, or the equivalent of 10 New York cities. And they'll also help to pave 5 billion square meters of roads. And they tend to go into the cities in China and snap up sort of the low-paying, dirty, dangerous, distasteful jobs that urbanites are not really so interested in. And they also carve out for themselves all sorts of different small-time entrepreneurial niches. So some people may haul heavy loads, they may do repair work, sell produce on the street corner. The man at the top here, he's popping popcorn. So there's sort of all sorts of things that people do, and generally they tend to be very light on their feet and able to sort of quickly remold themselves to meet the changing needs of the Chinese economy. And so, I met, in the course of the research I did for the book, I met many people who, within just the scope of a year or two, had sort of continually reinvented themselves time and again. So one woman had gone from selling eggs on the street corner to selling produce to shining shoes to running a small shop. And I looked at that and how quickly she could change directions. I felt amazed sort of by that ability. But she said, this is the way you do things when you don't have a lot of other options. And so as a result of this, urban China really couldn't function without migrant labor. I had this idea to do a blog post about how much the average urbanite's life depends on migrants. I live in Beijing now, so I had the idea I'd just take a picture of each person and write a couple lines about what they were doing in the city. And by the time I left my house in the morning and got to the subway stop, which usually is about a 20-minute walk, I gave up because it was taking the whole day. There was just so many migrants that my life depends on in the cities that became sort of an overwhelming project. But in addition to that, migrants are really essential to building up China's rural areas as well, because the money that migrants send back to the villages in lots of places really is the major portion of local income. And so they're really responsible for raising rural China out of poverty as well. So I want to tell you a little bit about how I came to write about this topic. When I went to China in 1997, I wasn't a journalist at that time. First I worked in education, and I had a lot of different opportunities, and one of them was I worked on this curriculum for children to learn English, and it was used in small towns around Guangdong province. And I would go and visit these schools about once a month to sort of track their progress and give some teacher training. And in one of the schools, the principal invited me to go with her, to stay an extra day and go with her back to her village where her relatives still lived. And so having lived in urban China for almost 2 years at that point, and really sometimes you don't see much grass or trees or any nature at all. And so I really jumped at the opportunity and went back with her. It was a banana farming village in the mountains, and we had a great day hiking and doing things like that. And at the end of the day, we were with her relatives, and they asked, "How did you like our village?" And I kind of gushed, and I said, "Oh, it's fantastic. I love it here." And so they said, "Well, if you like it so much, why don't you move here?" And I think looking back, I don't think they were probably sincerely inviting me as much as they were making polite small talk. But in my enthusiasm, I said, "Oh, I would love to." And so that's what I did. So about a month later, I moved to this village. And it was really a very interesting experience. It was definitely the first time that there had been a foreign person in the village, much less living in the village. And so very quickly, I became the local tourist destination. And people from the surrounding villages would walk to this village. In fact, someone came from about 20 kilometers away one time on foot to sort of verify, is it really true that there's a foreigner living here? And this is in the south of China, where it's very hot. And so the windows are always open, but there's bars. Everyone has bars on the windows. And so people would come and stand outside the window of my house with their hands on the bars and sort of stare in and watch me and have this ongoing commentary with each other about what they saw the foreigner doing. And so it was really a very interesting experience, but very wonderful. And the people especially were very sincere and very hospitable. And this was really, I think, pivotal for me in terms of helping me to think about China's rapid development from the point of view of the rural people, because so much of what we see in the media here, at least, is sort of the boom towns where everything is going very well in China. So this gave me a foundation, I think, for the book. And this is another picture of the village. It was called the Flower Fruit Village. And from there, I moved to Xi'an, which is the ancient capital of China. And it's most well known in the US, I think, for being the home to the terracotta soldiers. And it's also in Western China, which has been the least developed in the poorest part of China. And in fact, when China started its opening reforms 3 decades ago, they had this concept, basically, that they would allow a small part of the population first to become prosperous, and that those people then would pull everybody else up to prosperity. And so Eastern China, the sort of the crescent along the seaboard there, was chosen to lead everybody else to prosperity. And Western China was just sort of ignored largely for several decades and languished behind the rest of the country. And so I moved to Xi'an in 1999, and in January of 2000, the government launched what's called the Go West policy. And that essentially was designed to help Western China catch up with the rest of the country, because the gap between the two had really become unmanageable at that point. And so when the Chinese government decides to do something, sometimes it happens extremely quickly. And so within months of that policy opening, money came pouring into the city of Xi'an, and especially the high-tech zone. There was what's called the high-tech zone, which is where I was living at that time. And so from my window in my apartment in the high-tech zone, at any given time I would look out and there would be 15 to 20 cranes on the horizon putting up new urban developments. But what there also was, what I could also see really basically right behind my apartment complex, was this old village called Ganjiajai. And this is actually the village whose land the high-tech zone was built on. So what happens in China is that as the urban areas expand, the local city governments will buy up the neighboring farmland, but they don't generally buy up the cluster of village homes. And so the farmers who lose their land in this process, they take whatever money they're paid for their land, and they tend to use that to build onto their homes, or sometimes they gut their homes basically and start again. And then they rent out their homes room by room to the migrants who come into the new up-and-coming urban areas looking for work. And so this is extremely common in China. It's so common that there's a term for it, which is city village. And these city villages, you'll see them in every city in China, basically. And they're really the way that China has sort of avoided the absolute poverty, urban slums like you might see in India or Brazil or other countries. And because they provide such a sort of critical low-cost housing alternative for migrants, they tend to be very densely populated. So this village was originally home to about 1,500 farmers. And when I was living there, they estimated there was about 30,000 migrants sandwiched into 6 blocks. So it's very high population density. And then, of course, a lot of social problems follow along as well. And in 2004, so I lived there from 99 to 2004, and then I came back to the US for grad school, and I did a master's in journalism. And when I graduated, I received a fellowship to work on a book-length project. And so I knew that I wanted to write about all the transformation I had experienced in China. So I went back to that same neighborhood where I had lived before, and what I found was that the city village of Ganjiajai was about to be demolished. And everybody that I interacted with regularly, you know, the people who I bought vegetables from or who worked in restaurants, the security guards, everybody was very anxious and so upset about this because they lived in this village and there weren't many more of these villages left, and they weren't sure once these were gone, how could they support their life in the city anymore. And so that really became the backdrop for the book. Essentially, in the book, you'll find 8 different profiles of migrants who've come from different places in rural China into Xi'an, and they find work in the high-tech zone. They live in this old city village, and the book really kind of chronicles how successfully, or in some cases unsuccessfully, they're able to integrate into urban life and enjoy the fruits of their labors, and also how well they're able to accomplish the goals that they've set out for themselves. Now, in addition to that, what I try to capture in the book is also the spirit of the people, because I think that a lot of times the sort of storyline that you see in the media about rural people in China or about migrants is that they're downtrodden victims of oppression, that sort of concept. And that's not my experience with them, and I don't think that that's really the way that most migrants view their own reality. I think that overall they tend to be pretty upbeat, given the situation they're in. They tend to be pretty upbeat and optimistic about their future, and they're extremely enterprising. They find lots of ways to solve problems that I would have given up on long ago. And in Chinese, as David mentioned, there's this great word, which essentially, it doesn't translate directly into English, but it essentially means to endure hardship, to persevere, and to just sort of keep moving ahead without complaining. And so, for lack of a better word in English, if we translate it directly, it comes out to eating bitterness. And so that's where the title of the book comes from. And that's really, I didn't set off with this as a theme in mind in the beginning, but as I talked to different migrants over and over again, they themselves brought this up as being the key to their ability to survive in China, in urban China for so long. And really it emerges in every chapter, all the different ways that people have to change and grow and develop and persevere in order to keep a place for themselves in this really rapidly changing society. So I want to give you an overview of some of the stories in the book, but first I'm going to answer a few key questions that give you a little bit of background about migrants. So the first one is, who are China's rural migrants? And so people tend to think that they're the lowest level of society, but that's generally not the case. Over time, they're increasingly more well-educated and increasingly younger. So last year, a full 70% of migrants were under the age of 30, and 65% typically finished middle school. The thing, though, in China is that there's only 9 years of compulsory education. If you want to get into high school, you have to pass a very competitive entrance exam, and you also have to pay for high school. So in poor rural areas, less than 50% of people will go on to high school. So for a lot of people, they end up in the cities as migrants. The next question is, why do people come to the cities? Why are rural people coming to the cities? So the obvious answer to this is that there's a large and growing income gap in China. So urban income is about 3.5 times higher than rural income, and then also Eastern income is about 1.5 times higher than Western income. To put this in perspective, so I live in Beijing, and for a very average 2-bedroom house, with the ceiling is collapsing in our apartment, but for a very average, it's not a fancy house, it's very average 2-bedroom apartment, what I pay in rent each month is more than a farmer in Western China will make in an entire year. So that's a really significant driver pushing people to the cities to look for jobs with higher salaries. And related to this is an issue of a lack of land in China. So when China ended collectivized agriculture in the late 70s and early 80s, they had to do something with all of that land that previously was collectivized. So what they essentially did is every local village government divvied up all their farmland, and every resident of that village received a plot of land. And this is essentially still what's the system that's in place today. So if you're born as a rural resident in China, at birth you receive a plot of land. It's not exactly yours, so you cannot sell it. If you let the land go fallow, you'll lose it. And when you die, it goes back to the village to be redistributed to the next generation. But other than that, it's essentially yours for life. And so this is really, it's hard to sort of impress how important this piece of land is to these farmers. It's really their main sort of social security, and they really value this land. The problem comes, though, that by the time you divvy up all the arable land in China among 700 to 800 million rural residents, each person only gets about 1/6 of an acre of land. So even if you assume a Chinese family of 4, that's still 673 times smaller than the average American farm. So when you're talking about plots of land that are so small, farming in China is really not a viable livelihood. It's more of a sustenance insurance plan. It's just a way to make sure that you can keep your family fed. And so anyone who really wants to do more than just keep their family fed, they typically have to send at least one family member to the cities to look for work as migrants. Then I want to also look at what are some of the difficulties that migrants face when they arrive in the cities. There's a lot of them, and I'll just go over them quickly. But first one is working conditions. So they tend to be overworked. 70% or 80% will work 7 days a week, and 9, 10, 12, 15-hour days are very common. Also, they tend to be underpaid. And there was a lot of news in China a couple years back that migrant salaries had risen quickly, and they are now within about $20 to $30 of a college graduate starting salary. And so when this news came out, what happened is a lot of 7th graders, 6th, 7th, 8th graders started dropping out of school because they thought, oh, I can go to the city and make, about what a college graduate makes. But of course, what they're not really thinking about is that a college graduate, one, their salary is going to go up pretty steeply over the course of their life, but also a college graduate is not working 7 days a week, 16-hour days, 360 days a year. So if you look hour by hour, migrants are still quite underpaid. And then also in terms of living conditions, so these city villages are often built very haphazardly, a lot of safety hazards there. And also migrants, they live in very small spaces. So 50% of migrants will live in 8 square meters or less, which is essentially a bed with a walkway around it. So it's very small living space. And then these villages also, because people are so transient there, they have a lot of social problems and crime. And then there's difficulties in terms of social conditions. So many migrants, they leave their kids back in the village. Their parents are back in the village. Sometimes in the book, there's one family where the wife is in one city as a migrant, the husband's in another city as a migrant, and they have 2 daughters, each with a different relative in a different village. And so this is very common that migrants, their families are very split apart. And there's also a stigma among the urban population that migrants and migrants' children are sort of lower quality than the urban population. And I think also, you don't hear a lot of people talk about this, but I think psychologically it's also very difficult that you come from a village and you're living in this very new modern city and you're helping to develop it, and yet you yourself feel like you don't have any place there and you're not really a part of what's happening. So I think psychologically also there's a lot of difficulties. Now the last one I want to talk about is probably the biggest and hottest topic in China right now in terms of migration, and that has to do with China's hukou system, or its household registration system. And essentially, this is a system in which every person at birth is ascribed to a location in which they belong. And you're labeled as either an urban person or a rural person. So in China, urban and rural are not just adjectives, they're actually legal definitions. And once you are legal, and it's not, I should say, it's not based on where you're born, because then everybody would just go and have their kids in Beijing, but it's based on where your parents are registered. So, and once you're registered as a rural person, it's very difficult to change that registration to a city registration. The only really easy way to do that is to go to college. So if you can get into college, you can change your registration and become a full-fledged urbanite and sort of seamlessly integrate into society. But in rural areas, less than 25% of kids are going to have the opportunity to go to college. So for most people, once you're born as a rural person, that's it. For life, you're going to be officially a rural person. And so in the beginning of this system, actually China's had some version of this system on and off for 2,000 years. But the most recent reincarnation was implemented by Mao in the late 50s as a means of preventing people from fleeing the countryside when collectivized agriculture began. And so at that time, you had to have a lot of, if you wanted to leave where you were registered, you needed a lot of permissions, and it was considered illegal to move about, basically, without permission. But today, they don't use the system in that way. So people are free to move back and forth as they want. But what they do use the system for is to allocate benefits. So everybody in China is entitled to free education for their children, to subsidized health care. But you're only entitled to those things in the location in which you're registered. So for migrants, when they leave where they're registered and they come to the cities where they're not registered, they oftentimes their kids are turned away from urban schools. They can't get health care, they can't buy property, they can't get legal protection. So there's it's really created a bit of a two-class system. And in many ways, although these migrants are not considered illegal, they're treated in many ways similar to illegal immigrants would be in other countries. So this is really emerging as a big problem in China, and that brings me back to the point that migrants and issues related to migration are really emerging in China as the key domestic challenge that the government has to face. I think it's easy to throw out big numbers when you talk about China, but if you think about 300 million people moving within the next 20 years, that's basically like taking the entire population of the US and having every man, woman, and child leave wherever they are, go to a new place, get a new job, find a new place to live. And I think if we try to do that, obviously I think it would probably degenerate into chaos pretty quickly. So if you think about it from that perspective, you can really see the enormity of the challenge that is facing China right now and the potential for things to go wrong at multiple levels. I think probably things going wrong might be the expected norm when you're talking about such fast and in a wide-scale migration. So that really makes people like those that I'm writing about in Eating Bitterness critical to China's future. So I want to give you an overview of some of the stories that you'll find in the book. The book starts actually with this family of vegetable vendors who never intended to migrate to the city. But this is about 12 years ago, well, in the 90s, I should say, in the 90s, this man, he was doing construction as a part-time job in his village, and he was in an accident and was hospitalized for more than 2 years and had to have multiple surgeries and racked up medical bills that would be about 12,000 US dollars. But for a farmer in rural China in the 90s, that was an astronomical amount that he could never really hope to pay back on farming wages. And so his wife left him and their 1-year-old daughter in the village with his mother and went to the city to look for work. And so now they're reunited. That was about 12 years before I met them. And they're reunited now in Xi'an. And they work every day from 3 a.m. to 9 p.m. So 18-hour days, 7 days a week. Basically, they maybe take a day off for the Spring Festival. And so this has been the last 12 years they've been working like that. And what they told me is they do this really with one goal in mind. And that's that their daughter doesn't have the same sort of tired existence that they do, that she'll have more skills to offer society and something more to do with her life. Then there's also a chapter about young girls who don't pass the high school entrance exam. So right out of middle school at 15, they come to the cities looking for work. And these girls end up working in a chain of beauty salons, which is really a new industry emerging in Western China. And this chain of beauty salons is very good at holding up a picture of a very bright future the girls can have if they work hard and find a way to become managers in this company. And they're always kind of saying you can have a house and a car and you can become a permanent urban resident. And so the girls, for their part, they're really eager to accomplish these things, and yet they feel sort of helpless and hopeless because as fairly poorly educated girls coming from the countryside, they don't feel that they ever could really become managers in a company like this. And so they live with this underlying fear that if they don't get their act together and figure things out, they may not have a permanent place in the city. They may end up going back to their villages and being farmers like their parents. And so this is a very sort of common thing that happens to young people who come to cities. So this is that chapter. Then there's a chapter about a family who is actually one of the original families of farmers in the city village of Ganjiajai, and they lost their land when the high-tech zone was built. And probably you've followed the news, you've seen there's been a lot of protests in China in the last year. I think there was about 100,000 protests last year about farmers who've had their land unfairly grabbed from them, or they've been not well compensated for their land. And so that's a serious problem in China. But I've never seen anyone really talking about the other side of the picture, which is actually more common, which is farmers are paid well for their land. I don't think that probably isn't as catchy of a headline, so you don't see it very often. But in all the villages that I've been to, most farmers are sort of eagerly awaiting for the day when the city might expand out to their village, because they know that they'll make more money, that they'll get paid more money for their land than they could ever make farming their land. And so it's sort of seen like a lottery ticket if the city moves out to your village. And so this family, when their farmland was bought from them in the 90s to make way for the high-tech zone, at that time in China, an extremely wealthy person was not called a millionaire, they were called a 10,000-aire. So if you had 10,000 renminbi at that time, you were extremely wealthy. And they made at that time 50,000, they got paid 50,000 renminbi for their land. So they were 10,000-aires 5 times over. And on top of that, when I met them, by renting out rooms in their home, they made about 10,000 renminbi in income a month. And at that time, a software programmer in the high-tech zone would make about 3,000. So financially, they're very set. But what happens, and this is extremely common in this village, and I've seen this in many city villages, is that now they have, they're financially secure, but they don't have anything to do, and they don't really have a lot of other skill sets. So idleness and addiction really sort of seep in. And so this man, he's been addicted to mahjong for the last 20 years. And he told me it's his full-time occupation. And it's really sad in some ways. And in fact, in this village, many people told me that when they lost their land, the farmers now, some people turned to Buddhism. Like everyone was looking for something to occupy their time. So some people turned to Buddhism, some people turned to gambling. But then they said the most pitiful of us are those who didn't find anything. And we still don't know what to do with our time. So I think this chapter is pretty important because it shows the other side of the picture in terms of what happens when China's farmers who lose their land to urbanization are paid well. There's a whole new set of social issues that really creep in to these areas. And the book ends with the story of a 32-year-old second grade dropout who came to Xi'an essentially destitute, but within about 5 years amassed a small empire of convenience stores and health clinics and fitness centers. And really he's blown past all the typical obstacles that would be in a migrant's path. But he finds himself more lonely and isolated than he ever was as a poor man. And he has this desire to turn his sight away from his own material prosperity, and he wants to become a philanthropist. But he doesn't tell anybody this because he feels like in Chinese society today, nobody could really understand that desire, and they would sort of laugh at him and say, stop being silly, just focus on getting more rich, basically. And so I was really drawn to this story, not just because it's sort of the typical rags to riches story, but I think that it's really emblematic of the direction that modern China is headed. Because when China started its opening and reform policies 30 years ago, people had this underlying concept that first you have to focus on material prosperity. You have to have a strong material foundation, and then you can think about other things. And in fact, many people still have this idea today. So things that weren't sort of directly related to material prosperity were seen as distractions. But today, China's changed a lot in the last 30 years, and there are a lot of people now who are becoming quite wealthy and who are reaching those material dreams that they set out for themselves or surpassing them. And so you see in Chinese cities now a real restlessness setting in as people sort of are wondering, what else is there to life beyond just having a strong material foundation. And you see a rise of things that previously everyone thought were distractions, like religion or social activism, environmentalism, philanthropy. These things, are gradually on the rise now in China. And so I think that while most migrants aren't going to become as successful as this man, most urbanites aren't even going to become as successful as this man has become. Right now, the GDP in China is growing so fast that it's essentially doubling every 7 years. So everybody is seeing changes in their lifestyles. Everyone, not evenly, obviously, but everyone is seeing improvements. And so I think that at some point, these migrants who for decades have basically been sort of blindly pushing ahead and enduring difficulties, eating bitterness, without really having many demands or expectations, at some point, people are going to stop and sort of reassess that mentality and want more out of life and want more out of their labor. And you do see this happening already in China, especially among the younger generation, that they're willing to endure difficulties and eat bitterness, but only without it being sort of a temporary means to a more comfortable end. And so this is really a challenge to China because its whole development model has sort of relied on the fact that people are willing and able to endure a lot without having a lot of expectations and without complaining. So this is a challenge to China as it moves forward. And so that's where the book ends, and that's where I'd like to end today. So essentially, the book obviously is of interest to anybody who's interested in China or urbanization, migration, social transformation, development. But I think over and above that, it's a work of literary nonfiction that is really a human story in the end. So the term eating bitterness is a Chinese term, but it's obviously not an exclusively Chinese quality. It's a human quality that you see over and over in history as the human spirit sort of rises up and overcomes what seems to be insurmountable obstacles. And in this book, every chapter it has sort of tragedies that people face and yet also a lot of triumph as they overcome the difficulties. So that's where I will end. And if anybody has any questions, we can open it up for questions. The pollution in Xi'an, was so bad when I was there. When I first moved there, that where I lived in my apartment, there was no tall buildings. They were all being built sort of in the distance, so I could look out in the distance. And for a year and a half, I lived there, not knowing that one day there was a clear blue sky day, and suddenly I saw this huge mountain range right out my window that I had no idea existed for a year and a half. So the pollution there was very terrible. I think it's still pretty bad. Now I live in Beijing, and people who haven't lived in Xi'an think Beijing pollution is terrible, but I'm like, it's blue sky at least 50% of the time. So I haven't been there too often in the last few years, but I think it's still pretty. Yeah, that's definitely, in Chinese there's a term called the after 80s generation. So essentially anybody born after 1980 has only grown up in China's economic good times. And it's actually it's slightly derogatory term that the older generation will use to sort of say, oh, those kids born after 1980, they don't really know how to endure difficulty, and they never really face sort of deprivation and starvation and all these things that the older generations have gone through. So their work ethic is definitely very different, and I think it's a big challenge for the companies that employ them because they're not sort of willing to just go through so many difficulties without, for example, people don't want to migrate as far. They're having more and more difficulties getting people to migrate to the east because a lot of migration happens from west to east, obviously, because of the income gap. But so they're definitely, it's causing a lot of changes in the way migrants work in China. Yeah, probably the biggest thing that the government is doing is they're trying to expand that education system. And in fact, they've really spent the last decade trying to rapidly expand the education system. So if you look back in the 1990s, only about 3% of of students could get into college, because there just wasn't enough universities at that time. Today it's about 25% can get into college. Still that's low, but considering they went from 4 to 25% in a decade. And also the same with high schools, that they have not enough high schools for so many kids. And so the first thing they're trying to do is have more schools and allow more people to have higher levels of education so they can do more skilled jobs in the future. Also this whole issue of the household registration system, there's been a lot of pressure on China to get rid of that system, do something about that. But it's interesting because in the places where in cities where they've had pilot programs to get rid of that system, two things have happened. So one is that a lot of cities who offered urban benefits to the migrant population, they went bankrupt pretty quickly because they just didn't have the capacity to offer, benefits to so many more people. But the other thing that's happened is in Western China, for example, I forgot if it's in Chengdu or in Chongqing, but in Western China, one city had this policy that they wanted to allow 10 million migrants to trade in their rural registration for an urban registration so they could become official city residents. But in the first year of that program, they only had a few thousand takers. And this actually corresponds with what I saw when I was interviewing people, that many migrants said to me, we don't have many skills. We do physical manual labor, and at some point our bodies are going to break down. We're going to get old, we're going to get injured, something. And if we trade it in because your land is tied with that rural registration, if you give up your rural registration, you give up your land. So if they trade in that rural registration for an urban registration, they said, at some point when my body breaks down, how can I support my life in the cities? I don't have enough skill, to find any other kind of job. So most migrants right now, at least, are not willing to trade in that piece of land for, official urban status where you get more benefits. So it's a quandary for the government because they have this pressure to get rid of the system, and yet the people who, everyone's advocating for aren't really interested in giving up their rural residency right now. Though that's a good question. I mean, I wouldn't call it phenomenal success. I think China is a country with a lot of contradictions. So you see, like, for example, in the last 30 years, 600 million people were raised out of poverty. You see, an emergence of a really wealthy class now. But yet, at the same time, there's still people who are living, in very poor situations. So it's kind of a mixed bag, I think, in terms of China. But overall, I think, things have gone pretty smoothly for China. I think partly because people have such a work ethic. The other day when I said somewhere that China has lifted 600 million people out of poverty, and someone said, no, 600 million people in China lifted themselves out of poverty. So I think that partly that was a good distinction, because partly it is just the hard work ethic that people have that really have helped the country to move forward so quickly. And so it's going to be interesting as this younger generation has a very different sort of mindset and work ethic to see what's going to happen. There have been, in the recent years, there have been some small-scale protests that have happened. So I think one of the main ones that people protest about is they want their kids to be able to have education in the cities. Socially, the families being split up is not a good policy. And even families who bring their kids to the city, they can only bring them there for primary school. Because if you want to take the test to get into high school, you have to go back to the place where you're registered and take the test there. So so a big thing that people are sort of unhappy about is the situation with their children. And also in factories, for example, sometimes people don't get paid on time, or they don't get paid for months. So I've heard of protests about things like that, but I haven't seen anything sort of large scale happening. I think that is because people, one, they have this work ethic to just endure, but also I think there's a bit of the collective mentality in China that still is there, that you often hear people say, I personally don't like this situation or that situation, but I know that it's good for China, or I know that it's helping China to advance. And so people are sort of willing to put their own personal happiness or satisfaction aside for what they perceive to be the good of the country. I think it's probably the local governments who don't feel equipped to offer benefits on such a wide scale. And in some cities, like in Shanghai, 40% of the population is migrant population. So if you're suddenly going to offer them benefits as well, I think the local governments feel like they don't know how to deal with that, or they're not willing to deal with that right now. Yeah, I think that's true. Like, for example, in that chapter that I write about the landless landlords, the people who became wealthy when their land was bought up, they made the comment that in that city village now, the people who collect the trash or do the recycling or do any of those sort of jobs, none of them are the local people anymore, because they said once people have sort of, a financial stability, no one's willing to do those jobs anymore. So the people who do those jobs in a city village like that will all also be migrants. And so there's definitely, even among that population, there's the different classes that emerge. I don't know how that is going to play out in the future, but there's definitely is this group of people who, when their land is bought up, they become extremely wealthy, and a whole bunch of social problems follow that. Well, I should say that first so that was what happened in the factories in the South. In my book, I don't write about factory workers, because really they are something of a migrant subculture. So if you work in a factory, you work there, you're given a dormitory on the factory grounds, you eat in the factory cafeterias, they often have movie theaters or bowling alleys, it's a whole universe into itself. A lot of times the factories might have 70,000 employees, so we're talking about it's basically a city. So those migrants are really sort of isolated from the larger society. So I didn't write about those, so I don't know so much about the conditions in factories, but what I will say, and this isn't a justification for any abuses that happen in those factories, but that a lot of the migrants that I wrote about who are self-employed, they still choose to live almost identically to the factory workers. So for example, that family of vegetable vendors, on their own accord, they choose to work 18-hour days, and they live in what's essentially a one-car garage with no windows. There's a room for 2 beds, and when they want to eat, they turn a crate on its side, and it's sort of a makeshift table, and there's no plumbing. They cook in the hallways, that kind of thing. And so originally, as I got to know them, coming from my Western perspective, I assumed that they're just destitute, like they're doing this because they have no other options in life. But as I got to know them, it turns out no. In China, the savings rate is between 30 and 40%, but migrants try to be as close to 100% as they can. And so it's hard, coming from America, where I think it's a negative savings rate, if I'm not mistaken, to kind of wrap your mind around the fact that people will be willing to not just live at their means, but way below their means. So this family, actually, they've been saving money, for years, and they have enough money to build something of a mansion back in the countryside, and pay for their parents as they're getting older, and their kids' education, and all of these things. So I think it's important to sort of realize that the migrants aren't seeing their own reality as maybe we are viewing it and hearing about it in the media. So I think there are factories where conditions are bad, but from what I understand, in factories where they try to make conditions better, so they cut the overtime, for example, people will quit because they're there expressly for the purpose of making money. And even if this is a factory with better conditions, if it doesn't give them enough hours so they can make as much money as possible, they'll quit and go to a worse factory with longer hours so they can make more money. So. It's interesting to think about it from their perspective and their motivations. Yeah, that's a big concern in China, because China actually from the beginning had a lack of arable land considering its size. And then as more and more farmland gets bought up, obviously that's a concern. So the central government has tried to put a curb on the local government's ability to take farmland, not always with great success, because local governments buying up farmland and turning them into urban development, that's sort of the local government's major income source in lots of areas. But in terms of having enough people to do the farming, so the land is an issue, but in terms of the actual movement of people, China right now has way too many rural people. Considering now that it's mechanized agriculture, they don't need 700 million people. So that actually, as people leave the villages, it's very good for farming, because then fewer people left in the rural areas can have bigger plots of land, make salary that's somewhat more comparable to an urban salary. So definitely. So the literacy rate in China, I think in if you go back to the 1950s, it was less than 50%. In the 80s, it was about 60%, and today it's about 94% literacy. So most people can read, of course. And if you look at just the young population, it's about 99% literacy. So these people in this village, they definitely all could read. They went to middle school, that family, that man who's addicted to mahjong. But I think that there's a stereotype, at least in this province of China, that the men are sort of, the women will say that the men are lazy. And the women tend to be more the go-getters. And so, there's also a chapter where, in the book, where the wife is really wanting to sort of work her way up and become this official urban resident and get a house and all these things. And the husband is kind of like, we're fine, life is good, I can play pool all day, and why do we need to work so hard? So there's a bit of that you see, that people are just sort of like, I have money now, what do I need to sort of keep working? So people don't have maybe higher aspirations for themselves. But they definitely could, and a few people do, but overall there tends to be sort of this lethargy that sort of sinks in. Okay, well, thank you so much, everybody, for coming. It's been great.